Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the situational variables in obedience. We see from the specification that they ask us to look at three variables of proximity, location, and uniform, but there's been a change in the last 2 years of the specification that says that we look at proximity and location as investigated by Milgram, and then it says and uniform over there. So we will look at the uniform kind of separate from Milgram, but it's very similar to the variations in conformity research. They are specific to obedience, and Milgram in itself will be kind of the key study that we look at. So, as we saw with other variables affecting situational determinants and social influence, Milgram wanted to find out if there's any condition that he could change that could influence the outcome of the experiment. So, of course, we need to have something to compare it with. And so, of course, we're going to be comparing it with the 65% obedience rate that we found in the study that we originally looked at. So therefore, according to that 65%, we can see whether obedience increased or decreased when we go along. So looking at the first variable of proximity, there's going to be three different aspects to this. And so what's actually happening here is one variable, but several variations in the Milgram experiment. Now, the first one would be proximity to the learner. Okay, so what we're going to do now is that the experiment is going to run the same, except that instead of having the victim next door, it's going to be in the same room. Now, of course, the Mr. Wallace character is going to have to act this entire time, and Milgram's going to make a decision as to what is obedience and what isn't obedience. So in this particular case, I think all of us can know the answer, that we're probably less likely to want to hurt somebody when we can see the distress on their face. And of course, this is the outcome that we find. We see that obedience drops. Okay, that's the key there. Now, this 40% is in reference to Milgram's experiment. And in terms of knowledge, it's not necessary at this stage, but of course, we can certainly focus on the Milgram research later on. So obedience drops. And so that's the first aspect of proximity. So with this, Milgram was still surprised that it says here obedience was still relatively high. So he kind of changed, not only was the learner going to be in the room, he changed one more aspect of proximity, and we call this touch proximity. We're going to see whether the person who's designated to be teacher could actually physically contact the learner in order to punish them. So what they have to do is to place the learner's hand on the shock plate. So place the learner's hand on the shock plate. So they have to actually touch the learner, lift up his hand and put it onto the touch plate before they get the shock. And of course, once again, we expect that obedience drops, and it does. And of course, in relative to the 65%, it drops down to 30%. So in other words, we do know this, that face-to-face kind of proximity does cause us to perhaps kind of think about the damage we're doing, and certainly it could mean that we are less obedient because of this. Other explanations talk about things called buffers, where you kind of look at this idea that the smaller the buffer is, the larger the prospect of kind of hurting somebody else. And so therefore, please remember those two. But he also changed one more aspect of his research. This time, he wanted to see whether proximity to the authority, in other words, proximity to the teacher, would change the outcome of the experiment. In this particular experiment, the experimenter gets called out of the room and says that they're going to give the instructions over the phone. And in this particular case, we actually see one of the lowest forms of obedience, and it drops to 20.5%. And we see that this is obviously, as we would expect being in a school, we see that if the teacher leaves the room, then the behavior in the class often changes because the authority figure is no longer there. We could link this to this idea of surveillance as well. So there we have it, the first variable, quite simply about proximity. So then we can move on to the next variable, which is called location. Now, what we find is that the original experiment was at Yale University. It's a very nice university, kind of trees and grass and impressive buildings and stuff like that. And you could say that potentially that if you work in a university like that, the experimenter may kind of know what they were doing because of the prestige of the place. Here's a picture of Yale University. I haven't been there, but a friend of mine studied there, and she said it was absolutely lovely. And so that's what we can expect. And so what Milgram does near the end of his time searching and studying obedience is that he decides to move the whole setup to a different location. So he moves the location to Bridgeport, Connecticut. Okay, and here we have the same machine, we have the same Mr. Wallace, we have the same experimenter, everything's exactly the same, but it's conducted in offices. So in other words, it doesn't have the prestige of learning, prestige of science. I can't get a picture from the 1960s of Bridgeport, but this is a typical example of it. And we find this kind of industrialized area, kind of office buildings, things like that. And interestingly enough, what we find is once again, obedience drops. And I suppose it's this idea of perception, perceived authority. So in a less scientific, less knowledgeable location, the perception of the authority of science or the authority of the experimenter does drop down, and we find obedience is at 47.5%. So as you can see, we go through these particular ideas quite quickly. So then we can quickly move on to uniform. Now, there is a reference to a study in my previous slide. It's reference to this idea that the experimenter wore this kind of grey lab coat. And when he was replaced by somebody who didn't have a lab coat, there was a significant drop in obedience. And because this particular variation actually has two things changing there, it was both the experimenter and the lab coat that were changed. We no longer specifically look at uniform according to Milgram. What we do look at is other things that we might expect. That we expect that somebody wearing a uniform does have legitimate authority. So once again, going back to that explanation of authority, legitimate authority, and we're familiar with police officers kind of potentially having that legitimate authority. So in order to demonstrate this, we don't really turn to Milgram, we turn to Bickman. Bickman did a really interesting kind of study in the 1970s. It's not perfect. We'd have to repeat this in different time frames, different parts of the city in order to kind of see whether the results are still the same. But he's confessed to dress in three different uniforms, a jacket and tie, Milgram's outfit, and a security guard. Now, of course, we're not that familiar with jacket and tie. In a sense, we think that as smart businessmen, but the equivalent would probably be something like chinos and a polo shirt and trainers. It's meant to be a civilian everyday outfit. The milkman perhaps could be seen as somebody who's in like a Sainsbury's or waitress outfit, and kind of somebody who kind of does quite a menial job, quite a necessary job, but kind of not that kind of authoritarian. Also, we see then security guard is the security guard. So what he gets them to do is to go into the city and literally give simple instructions to pick up rubbish, give me money for the parking meter, move away from the bus stop, things like that. So I would ask you kind of what would we expect? Could we tell the difference between who was more obedient and who is less, who had more perceived obedience and the less perceived authority? And this is the outcome of the study. What we do find is that people were more likely to obey the security guard. Okay, so they're more likely, so twice as likely to obey the security guard than the person in civilian clothes. Okay, and we said this just decreases when the uniform was the milkman. So in other words, there's a difference even between the two different uniforms. It's not just any uniform, it's the policeman's uniform that's important here, or the guard uniform that becomes important. So people do believe that people in police uniforms certainly have some form of legitimate authority. It's why we would stop if a police officer in uniform asks us to stop. We also could extend this to other situations. Think of the practical questions they could ask us about people in different places, like a nurse in a hospital or a civilian on a train, trying to ask people to kind of put their feet down, as opposed to somebody in a uniform, a guard uniform, things like that. Okay. So let's look at some of the evaluation points, and we find, of course, there is research for the uniform. So I've already told you about Bickman. We can turn to another bit of evidence by Bushman. What I like about this particular research is trying to find out whether a female authority figure could also command obedience, potentially based on uniform. And we see that when the Confederate had a police style uniform, she had very high obedience, 72%, when asking a stranger for money. And this dramatically dropped down to when she wore a business suit. However, quite interestingly, when she was dressed as a beggar, she got more people kind of helping her. And I suppose there's got to have something to do with sympathy. Now, I say at the bottom here that this highlights the power of uniform. Absolutely, we can use Bushman for this. It does also support Milgram's finding, but I would also say it supports Bickman's findings. And therefore, we got quite a nice kind of point there to demonstrate that uniform is quite important. Now, the second part of this evaluation is going to change to a different style. So it says here a comparison of the different obedience levels could be considered as evaluation. So what I haven't done is, well, I have referred to percentages of the Milgram experiment, but I kind of want you to know that Milgram himself is really obviously important as evidence for showing us that situational variables do support obedience or drop or rise in obedience. And so what we find is we have a kind of a diagram like this that we could draw where we have kind of a steady drop in obedience between the different situations. So the rundown office we see has a particular type of obedience. We have the baseline of being 65. So we can do a direct comparison between something like the baseline and the touch plate proximity example. So please remember that Milgram does support situational variables. Okay, so please use them in order to explain the point. Now, lastly, we turn to a criticism, and this is quite an interesting criticism because it's one of the big critics of Milgram. This person's called Mandel, and he's very critical of Milgram for this thing called the obedience alibi. An alibi is a legal kind of way out. It's a if somebody is accused of something and they can quite literally kind of demonstrate that they were not there or couldn't do it, then the chances are that they will have an alibi. So what we find is that Mandel accuses Milgram's research of giving an alibi for the Nazis and the war crimes. So let's go back to my criticism here. So he's criticizing specifically the situational variables, saying that they do not explain extreme situations. So let's give an example of extreme situation. So, for example, on the 13th of July, 1942, in Poland, the men of the police battalion 101 carried out a mass killing. So that's the extreme situation here. Now, why is this an example? Mandel said situational determinants should explain the behavior. So, for example, we found that when the proximity was altered, that people were less obedient. So, what we find in this particular place in Josefa was that the people who were carrying out the executions were actually friends and potentially family with the Jews. It was a small town in Poland that was kind of mixed Jewish and Polish. And of course, when the war broke out, if you were Jewish, you were separated. And then there were also these Nazi sympathetic people. Okay, so in other words, you would expect that because of the proximity, that they would not have killed their friends and family. Second of all, you also would have found in terms of proximity, they were killed at close range. They were killed very easily, face to face. They were shot. If you think about the concentration camps, often they were led into these shower blocks, and remotely a cyanide pill was dropped into it. So there's this idea that distance, even proximity to the victim, clearly hasn't stopped this. But the last thing you could also argue is that this mass murder should not have happened according to situational determinants, because we find that when location was altered, that obedience once again dropped. But in this particular case, they took them out into this field next to the roadside where there was a ditch, and they killed them there. So there's nothing there that's important. There's no concentration camp. There's no building. There's no anything illustrating that they should have obeyed. So despite all these situational determinants saying that people were less likely to obey, this massacre still happened. And so Mandel is particularly kind of clear that in the real world, these situational determinants don't work as Milgram had said. It does not decrease obedience. Now, once again, I would remind you to have a look at the particular pages in your textbook, just to kind of check that you do understand what the situational variables are, that you can clearly name them and explain them, that you can also have some kind of evaluation of them. Now I'm just going to show you one more question. I haven't got a written response to this, but I just kind of want to point out that this is the type of question that they quite like to ask. So it says, referring to research into obedience, explain 3 reasons why the instructor's advice should be effective. So the key here is should be effective and 3 reasons. Now, of course, it doesn't necessarily say anything about situational variables. We have to read the scenario to find out that it is about situational variables. And we see a couple of things. So always wear your jacket. That's clearly going to be uniform. Stand up close is clearly going to be proximity. And of course, should be dealt with in the instructor's office is going to be location. So we find that the key to this question, in order to get the full 6 marks, is to explain how wearing your instructor's jacket would be more effective for the instructor. And so things like it's very clear, visible sign that they are the person in charge, that they have legitimate authority. Standing up close means that there's an element of intimidation and fear, but also it's quite clear line of sight of who is important, who's the person giving the instructions. And of course, in terms of instructor's office, in terms of location, we find that it takes them away from perhaps an open expanse where maybe into a smaller place that clearly is important and shows the importance of the situation that you might find yourself, so therefore becomes more effective. So there we go. I hope that you have enjoyed this short video. I hope that you continue